So now let's turn to some problems for this view of Plato's forms as expressed in his middle period. The first and most glaring problem is, how does Plato know that the form of the beautiful is beautiful itself? How does he know that the form of the good is itself good? If we take a very ordinary form, let's say, to be very simple about it and least controversial, let's say we go for something like an even number. Well, all the even numbers have something in common. They are all 2 times any number, twice any number. That defines the even numbers. Now, if we then take that set of things, that many, and we ask, what is the one that all of those numbers have? The answer is, well, they're all even. They all have evenness as their form, if you like. Well, we wouldn't say that evenness itself has evenness. I think you'll agree with that. Evenness doesn't, in any obvious sense, have evenness. If we were to do the same thing with prime, with the definition of prime, which we could easily do, then we wouldn't say that the form primeness, as we've defined it, we wouldn't say that primeness is prime. Evenness is not even, doesn't have evenness. Primeness is not prime. With each of those things, you can see it doesn't really make any sense to say that. And you can go on. There's no clear sense in which, even if we suppose that there is a form of, I don't know, say a form of a planet. Suppose that there is such a thing as the form of a planet. In what sense is the form of a planet a planet? This touches on a particular argument against this style of form. It was given a name by Aristotle. It's called the third man argument. And essentially the idea is, well, suppose you have 2 men. They have something in common, namely they both instantiate the form of man. So manness, humanness, because that's really what it was, humanness. If they do instantiate the form of humanness, well, is humanness a man? If so, it's a third man. So we've now got 3 men. And then take all these 3. What do they all have in common? Well, they're all men, so they have something in common, namely another form of manness, namely, it's not clear what you would say here, but another form of manness, well, or humanness, well, that's another man, that's 4 men. This is absurd. Even if there is a form of human, which I seriously doubt, but even if there is such a thing as the form of a human, it doesn't make any sense to say that that form is human, or a human being, or what would you want to say? So the whole idea that Plato starts with, he gives the idea that it's that there's something natural in saying that if we have all of the beautiful things and we then extract the form from that form is beautiful beyond anything that we would be inclined to encounter in this earthly realm. We've got something which is perfectly beautiful, that it is the essence of beauty, and therefore it is beautiful. So even though Plato carries us along with this idea that there is something plausible, and maybe he only thinks it's plausible in these cases, that the form of the beautiful would be itself beautiful, and that the form of the good would be itself good, and that the form of justice would be itself just. Maybe in those three cases, you could say that this makes some sense, but it wouldn't make any sense if you were to extend the forms into universals like evenness or primeness or electronness. It would not make any sense to say that electronness is an electron. So, this idea of the form of beauty and good being both beautiful and themselves being beautiful and good, what is the basis for that? Well, I described that Plato's view here is really a form of a vision, a visionary view. So it's worthwhile seeing what that vision actually amounts to and in its details. It comes in the Phaedrus. It comes in the Phaedrus in a long passage which describes the gods' ascent to the rim of heaven. The gods, with all of their spiritual, godly companions who are allowed to go with them, go to the rim of heaven, which means, remember that for the Greeks, the stars were a very, very dramatic, conspicuous presence at night. They turned in a wheel, the stars all turned together in a wheel, and that was of central importance for them. We forget it today. Most city dwellers rarely ever see the stars at night in an eclipsed form, in a way which sees them, as it were, with a clear sky, with no light pollution. It's a rare sight for us these days, and that's been true of the last 100 years, since the invention of streetlights, etc. We have so much light pollution that we have lost something which is of incalculable importance to us as a species, and that is a view of the night sky. It is one of the things which you could say restores us to ourselves. Well, that's certainly how the Greeks felt about it. And so Plato has this vision of us, or spiritual beings who have earned their right to do so, to do this, to accompany the gods to the outside of that, the sort of the screen of stars, this sort of the vast circular screen of stars, which are all, in a sense, in a disk in front of us, the disk that rotates. And the gods go to the rim of this disk to see what is beyond it. And here's what they see according to the Phaedrus. So, this is Phaedrus, and it's roughly lines 247 BC, DE. So, this is their feast. This is them feasting, in a sense, on their vision beyond the circular disk of stars. When they turn to food and go to one of their banquets, they journey skyward to the rim of the heavenly vault. When the souls we call immortal reach the rim, they make their way to the outside and stand on the outer edge of heaven. And as they stand there, the revolution carries them around while they gaze outward from the heaven. The region beyond heaven has never yet been adequately described in any of our earthly poets' compositions, nor will it ever be. But since one has to make a courageous attempt to speak the truth, especially when it is truth that one is speaking about. Here is a description. This region is filled with true being. True being has no color or form. It is intangible and visible only to intelligence, the soul's guide. True being is the province of everything that counts as true knowledge. So since the mind of God is nourished by intelligence and pure knowledge, as is the mind of every soul which is concerned to receive its proper food, it is pleased to be at last in a position to see true being. And in gazing on the truth, it is fed and feels comfortable until the revolution carries it around to the same place again. In the course of its circuits, it observes justice as it really is. Self-control, knowledge, not the kind of knowledge that is involved with change and differs according to which of the various existing things, to use the term existence in its everyday sense, it makes its object, but the kind of knowledge whose object is things as they really are. That vision is Plato's answer to the question of how we know these forms in and of themselves. There is no rational argument here. And it's not a rational argument. It's not a rational view. It's a vision, a visionary view. To forestall some people's ideas here, I'll say that there is no mention, and I don't think there's any mention anywhere in Plato of drugs. These visions are not fed by drugs. The visions are fed by philosophers contemplating the forms in and of themselves. And contemplating them, obviously, at night, under the stars, in a kind of intoxication of the stars. And as has been noted by many authors, this seems to also be, in many ways, that this is described in this section by Plato, and this and before. This seems to be connected in some way to the Orphic mysteries, as I was saying last week. Again, what that connection is quite, we don't exactly know. But the idea that somehow the Orphic mysteries are an initiation into this contemplative realm seems to be agreed upon by Plato's scholars. So there you have it. It is really quite something. Plato is really, in this sense, at least at this point, in this way, he's a mystic. His view is that of a mystic. People who are interested in mysticism tend to ignore this. And that's unaccountable. Because most of the people, most Westerners, have more in common with this view, because of the way in which it fed the Western intellectual tradition, than they would with Eastern views, which they seem to feel are part of their sort of natural mystical view. But Plato's view is mystical. One may not, there are many who may not like that to be said, who may wish to see Plato as a pure rationalist. And one can only say he's not. Okay, from here let's go on and look at other criticisms of Plato's view, because, well, there are some. Let's go on from here. So we've covered one problem, the problem of self-exemplification. What are some of the others? Well, one problem is the problem, which is really not much discussed by Plato, the problem of how universals or forms, how forms are instantiated in individuals. A particular person is supposed to have the form of being human. They may have the form of tallness or something, or being overweight or whatever. So the forms are meant to be exemplified in individuals, but how? What does that mean? What are individuals? Now, I think one thing that one might say here is that Plato does suggest that the real world is the world of the forms. The forms are the things. That's being. That's what he says. That is being. It's a little bit of Parmenidean in some ways, and that's significant, I think. So there's a sort of real world, and the real world consists of forms. But then what does one say about the world that we see around us? When it's not a world for Plato, it's a sort of shadow of the world of forms. In that great biblical phrase, it is the forms, like, seen through a glass darkly. That seems to be what individuals are. So they are what we see when we see John, whatever, is a collection of the forms which are here exemplified. How are they exemplified here? What does that mean? What does it mean to say that John exists for, say, 80 years or something? What does it mean for a thing to be in existence for a long time? And exemplifying perhaps different forms as they go. What is an individual? And how does it relate to the forms? I don't think that Plato gives an answer to this question that is really satisfactory. He says more about it, more about what the world consists of. But it tends to be, again, an elaboration of the forms. So in some ways, Plato is like Parmenides. Parmenides thought that the real things, being, has a necessary existence and it's incapable of change. Well, that's also Plato's view. The forms have a necessary existence and they're incapable of change. What Plato wants to do is somehow relate that to a world that is changing. But how does that work? I don't think that there is a clear answer in Plato for this. Even, let's suppose we abandon the idea of self-exemplification, which, we certainly should on almost all forms. If you're going to extend the notion of forms to things like, beds, is there a form of a bed? Well, in the Republic, Plato does think that there is a form of a bed. What is the form of a bed? I don't think that makes any sense. Just as it doesn't make any sense to say that the form of an even number, evenness, is even. So, let's suppose that this is a glaring problem for Plato. Let's just say that there is a huge problem relating the forms to the individuals that are meant to instantiate the forms. If you think of those instances as genuine objects, as things, then you're more or less creating a world in which those things exist. You're saying there are things, we exist in a world of things, but those things instantiate forms, maybe different forms over time. If that's what you're saying, and it's how Aristotle interprets Plato, the way that Aristotle wants to understand this matter, and the way perhaps it is natural in some ways to understand this matter, it becomes a kind of two-worldism, where you've got forms and you've got things, particulars, they exist in two different realms. How do the forms get to instantiate themselves in the things? Becomes the obvious issue. A further issue on this same similar point is this. The forms, as they are conceived of by Plato, tend to be what one calls in logic monadic predicates. They are forms that are forms of things corresponding to single properties, to properties of things, like being tall, being beautiful, being good, etc., etc. It's not clear how the theory of forms is going to deal with relations. John is the father of Peter. Peter is the brother of David, etc. Relations, this is a crucial point about philosophy, and it's going to become really important, maybe one of the most important points. Relations are dealt very, very badly by Plato because he doesn't seem to really engage with them. Or rather, perhaps it's better to say this, that his theory of forms doesn't really seem to work for relations. You need two things. They need to be related in some way. If that relation is an asymmetrical relation, then it has to be directional. John is the father of Peter. Peter is not the father of John, so it's an asymmetrical relationship. How does that asymmetrical relationship fall on John and Peter from the forms? What is that going on there? Some people have perhaps tried to reduce all things to what we call monadic predicates, that is, predicates that are applied to a single thing. So you might say fatherhood is the single thing that applies to John. But even if fatherhood is a thing that applies to John, a singular form that applies to John, that doesn't tell us what John's relationship is to Peter by itself. Even if you say Peter is a son, that doesn't tell us. We need again the idea that John is a father of Peter. We need that asymmetrical relation again. So I think the problem of relations becomes almost the fundamental problem of Western metaphysics. It rides on the back of the other problem, the glaring problem that we have, is that there are obviously, we obviously talk about kinds of things, and those kinds of things are things that we can't do without. There are many human beings, there are many electrons, there are many planets, there are many stars. There are many things that are green. Our language would not work without there being such terms as this in which to describe the world. We can't just make do with a series of proper nouns. We can't call everything by a proper noun. So this argument gets its clearest formulation in Bertrand Russell, in Bertrand Russell's book, 100 Years of Philosophy. That's it right there, 100 Years of Philosophy. Bertrand Russell said this very clearly and well, I think. Here is what he says. I think Russell gets this really right. And it's not been said clearer, but it's also said in a very balanced way. And that balance is really crucial because it's often been lost in other authors. Okay, here is Russell. Plato's doctrine of ideas contains a number of obvious errors, but in spite of these, it marks a very important advance in philosophy, since it is the first theory to emphasize the problem of universals, which in varying forms has persisted to the present day. Beginnings are apt to be crude, but their originality should not be overlooked on this account. Something remains of what Plato had to say, even if after all necessary corrections have been made. Even after all necessary corrections have been made. The absolute minimum of what remains, even in the view of those most hostile to Plato, is this: that we cannot express ourselves in a language composed, as I was just saying, composed wholly of proper names, but must have also general words such as man, dog, cat, or if not these, then relational words such as similar, before, and so on. Well, as we said, Plato doesn't really have those relational words. Such words are not meaningless noises, and he's right. And it is difficult to see how they can have meaning if the world consists entirely of particular things, such as are designated by proper names. There may be ways of getting around this argument, but at any rate it affords a prima facie case in favour of universals. I shall provisionally accept it as in some degree valid. But when so much is granted, the rest of what Plato says by no means follows. And this is perhaps his most idiosyncratic, well, not idiosyncratic, I mean it is his most sort of trenchant and pointed remark here. In the first place, Plato has no understanding of philosophical syntax. I can say Socrates is human, Plato is human, and so on. In all these statements, it may be assumed that the word human is exactly the same meaning. But whatever it means something which is not of the same kind as Socrates, Plato, and the rest of the individuals who compose the human race. In other words, you can't just iterate all of the people that there are and say, well, that's the exhaustive meaning of human. You can't do that because the next person who's born then wouldn't be human by that definition. It's absurd. Human is an adjective. It would be nonsense to say human is human. Plato makes a mistake analogous to saying human is human. He thinks that beauty is beautiful. He thinks that the universal man is the name of a pattern man created by God, of whom actual men are imperfect and somewhat unreal copies. He fails altogether to realize how great is the gap between universals and particulars. His ideas are really just other particulars, ethically and aesthetically superior to the ordinary kind. He himself, at a later date, began to see this difficulty, as appears in the Parmenides, which contains one of the most remarkable cases in history of self-criticism by a philosopher. Now, I'm going to come to the Parmenides a little bit later and add whatever there is to say about that, in addition to what we've already said about the forms here. I think that the general point is correct. I think that one has to say this because there is a general sense abroad now that because there are criticisms of Plato's theory of forms, that therefore that means that there are no universals. Well, as my teacher in philosophy, Michael Bradley, pointed out, it's unclear that anyone in the history of philosophy has seriously said that. Because there are, as Russell points out, there are adjectives that have a meaning and that seem to denote generalities. Man, cat, dog, etc., etc. So these things do mean something. The question is, what is their meaning? How do they get their meaning? Is the meaning constituted by the reference to what Russell implies is another particular, namely a form existing outside of the realm of particulars? How would that form be related to the particulars, the individual man, etc.? One has to wonder in this case, as a sort of deep problem, which is sort of implied in this sort of Platonic view, are there really any such things as individuals? Or is that merely an approximative notion that doesn't really mean anything? We tend to think universals, ideas, forms, don't mean anything. But perhaps it's also the case that individuals don't mean anything, or that individuals don't mean anything in the way that we try to think of them as doing, the way that, in fact, Aristotle really did think of them as doing. Aristotle, in a sense, fills this gap by giving us a theory of individuals. And maybe we just shouldn't buy that idea at all. Well, these are interesting questions, and they're really, in a sense, the whole of metaphysics, or at least a very large part of it. In delving into the problem of the forms in Plato, as they appear in Plato, we're really getting to the heart of metaphysics. What are these universals that we seem to have to talk about? It's not enough, just as some recent students of philosophy want to say, thinking that it's somehow an obvious position if you reject the forms. It's not enough to say, well, there aren't any forms. There's just this world, which is the sort of way that it's often put as a sort of strident, don't postulate things in another world. Just don't do that. All right. Let's not postulate things in another world. Let's think that perhaps there are individuals, let's provisionally at least. We have to have some way of generalizing them together. We have to have some word for collections of things that are similar or the same. There are many electrons in the world. We have to have a name for them. Electrons. Those, I can go on, protons, neutrons, etc. Those are things. They are kinds of things that exist. We can't do without that. We can't be deceived into thinking that there is an easy skeptical solution to this problem of just denying everything. It's not going to work. If we're going to have a theory here, we're going to have a better theory. So to conclude, what we want is a theory of individual properties, at least some of them, things that matter, like electrons, protons, neutrons, etc. We need those. We probably need cats, dogs, humans. We need that. We need relations, which we don't really have in Plato, and we don't have I think, in Aristotle either. I would say it's a problem in Aristotle just as much as it's a problem in Plato. We do need relations. I think today, more than ever, it has been impressed upon us that relations are absolutely, crucially fundamental in the universe, for reasons that I'll come to. So a simplistic skepticism about these things is not what we want, really. We want a better theory. And the question is, can we get one? Can we get one that saves the little bit of Plato that seems right, rejects certain other aspects, the self-exemplification and the preference for monadic properties? And can we do that without creating this kind of separation of worlds between supposed individuals and supposed forms? Can we do that? Now, let's say this is not an easy thing. Philosophers ever since Plato, have been trying to do this, to solve this problem. It's not an easy problem to solve. As Bradley pointed out, no one has a solution to this that is obvious. And for the 20th century, there was a tendency to think that one could just make do with individuals and one didn't need properties. I think that absurdity has had its day. It was a terrible idea. All right, it had to be tried out, it had to go through its paces, but I think we're now at the point where we can say this definitively failed, and we need universals as well, even if the theory that we have of them is unclear. In a sense, now you have the idea of where these lectures are heading. It is the solution to these problems that come from Plato. But, that said, we aren't finished with Plato. There are other dialogues of Plato that have an importance for our topic, and we'll come to those. At least we'll come to those shortly, perhaps in the next video. Forms willing, I'm prepared to say. Forms willing.